Hi there, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. I'm Bob Ronai, and this is lesson number 6, the first part of CPT, Carriage Paid To, and CIP, Carriage and Insurance Paid To, Named Place of Destination. But first, the necessary disclaimers. I am not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents in this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication 723E of the ICC. My explanations, my comments and my opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. In this lesson, we will look specifically at CPT and CIP, the more complex and contentious articles, especially A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery, with A2's 2 unstated options. Then we'll look at A6 and B6, delivery and transport document, and A9 and B9, allocation of costs. CPT and CIP are identical in these articles. Then in the following lesson, we'll look at A10 and B10 notices and CIP's insurance articles A5 and B5 and letters of credit problems. I'll explain what the book says first, as always, which is where other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop if they go that far, but then I will examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. A2, delivery. The seller must deliver the goods by handing them over to the carrier contract in accordance with A4, or by procuring the goods so delivered. In either case, the seller must deliver the goods on the agreed date or within the agreed period. It's essential to understand that delivery does not mean shipment on board the vessel or on the aircraft, nor does it mean arrival or when the buyer receives the goods. The seller has no responsibility as to when the goods are eventually shipped, or even if they are shipped on board, even though they contracted for their carriage. As we saw in A3, risk of loss or damage to the goods transfers to the buyer at the moment of delivery, not on arrival at the destination place. This rule covers any mode or combinations of modes without attempting to detail them because they are largely irrelevant to the operation of this rule. For example, truck from the seller to the container yard or container freight station, movement by ground equipment, then on the vessel, and reverse at destination. It's worth noting that this rule makes no mention at all about exactly where the seller delivers. Now, this is because the seller is delivering to its own carrier, so there's no need for the coordination between the buyer's carrier and the seller. Now, it's fine for the seller, but what about the buyer knowing when and where delivery occurred for the transfer of risk to them? I suggest, therefore, that in this we have the same 2 options as in FCA. A, at the seller's premises, loaded on the collecting vehicle, and B, at the carrier's premises, not unloaded from the seller's vehicle. B2, taking delivery. the buyer must take delivery of the goods when they have been delivered under A2 and receive them from the carrier at the named place of destination, or if agreed, at the point within that place. In this rule, there are two critical points: delivery when the goods are handed over by the seller to its carrier, and the place of destination where the buyer must receive the goods from the carrier. Many people incorrectly think that because the destination place is named after CPT and CIP, that is where delivery occurs. But that is not correct. Risk of loss or damage to the goods between these 2 points is the buyer's, because as we saw in A3, risk transfers at delivery. The seller is not responsible if the goods don't reach the destination. The buyer must receive the goods from the carrier, even though they have not entered into a contract with that carrier. Often the buyer will not know in advance who the seller is contracting as the carrier. The buyer will generally not be aware or even advised of the exact moment of delivery, and thus when risk shifts to them. A6, delivery and the transport document. If customary, or at the buyer's request, the seller must provide the buyer, at the seller's cost, with the usual transport documents for the transport contracted in accordance with A4. This transport document must cover the contract goods and be dated within the period agreed for shipment. If agreed or customary, the document must also enable the buyer to claim the goods from the carrier at the named place of destination and enable the buyer to sell the goods in transit by the transfer of the document to a subsequent buyer or by notification to the carrier. When such a transport document is issued in negotiable form and in several originals, a full set of originals must be presented to the buyer. It's worth noting that there is no requirement for the transport document to indicate the time and place that delivery occurred. Reference to the document enabling the buyer to receive the goods from the carrier refers to bills of lading, as airway bills and land transport documents are not typically used this way. Reference to allowing the buyer to sell the goods in transit by way of transferring the document also refers to bills of lading, even though it could be problematic. Reference to the transport document being in negotiable form refers only to bills of lading. B6. The buyer must accept the transport document provided under A6 if it is in conformity with the contract. Now, reference to the transport document being in conformity with the contract I think is a little odd, because most contracts say very little about the transport document. Maybe it would have been better, in hindsight, to say if it evidences transport in the mode and delivery time or period agreed in the contract. A9, allocation of costs. The seller must pay A, all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, other than those payable by the buyer under B9. B, transport and all other costs resulting from A4, including the costs of loading the goods and transport-related security costs. C. Any charges for unloading at the agreed place of destination, but only if those charges were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. D. The seller must pay the costs of transit that were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. E. The costs of providing the usual proof to the buyer under A6 that the goods have been delivered. F. Where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to export clearance under A7A. And G. The buyer for all costs and charges related to providing assistance to the seller in obtaining documents and information in accordance with B7A. The seller pays all the costs of carriage, freight and inland charges, up to the place of destination. If the goods are full container loads, the contract of carriage will almost invariably include delivery into the container yard, the terminal. If the goods are LCL, the contract of carriage will almost invariably include delivery into the CFS and unpacking from the consolidation. If the goods are by air, the contract of carriage will necessarily include delivery into the carrier's terminal or warehouse from the aircraft. Terminal charges, storage, demurrage, detention, once the goods are waiting in the terminal for collection, are not for the seller. The contract of sale, I suggest, should be very clear that from the moment the goods arrive into the destination terminal, all terminal handling charges, storage, demurrage, detention are for the buyer if the buyer for any reason has a delay or fails in their import formalities. The seller, though, should be aware that if the buyer fails to collect the goods, then all storage, demurrage, detention charges will be for them, the seller. Trying to then send the goods to another country might be impossible due to the export rules in the buyer's country. Now, consider also if the goods are in a container, then the shipping line that owns that container may not be happy with that container going to another country which they do not service. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer must pay A. All costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under A2, other than those payable by the seller under A9. B. The costs of transit, unless such costs were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. C. Unloading costs, unless such costs were for the seller's account under the contract of carriage. D. The seller for all costs and charges related to providing assistance to the buyer in obtaining documents and information in accordance with A5 and A7B. The buyer must pay, where applicable, duties, taxes and any other costs related to transit or import clearance under B7B, and F. Any additional costs incurred if it fails to give notice in accordance with B10 from the agreed date or the end of the agreed period for shipment, provided that the goods have been clearly identified as the contract goods. In our next lesson, we'll continue with CPT and CIP, the insurance aspects of CIP and A10 and B10 notices. Then we'll examine the problems these two rules have with letters of credit transactions. As always, I'll explain what the book says first, and then I'll examine the issues arising from these articles as we go along. Till next lesson, if you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell, and please feel free to leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below.